welcome to Context with me, Corin, Dann.
And me, Guyon, Espiner.
Context is the backstory to the front page story.
That's right. We take an issue which is making news today and we trace its long shadow back to figure out how it is we got to where we are today.
That's right, and there's a catch, of course. Only one of us knows the topic of what we're talking about.
That's right. We take turns being fair and balanced, folks. And Corin, you are up today, so what are you going to drop on me?
Well, what if I hold this book up? Will that give you any idea? This book here called Seeds of Distrust. The story of the GE cover-up from
good
Nicky,
stuff.
Hager like lager. I'll get to that, but what we're going to talk about is genetic modification. And it is a fascinating topic because it seems as though 30 years on, it has still not been resolved in terms of any allowance for genetic modification or GE technology to be used on plants or crops or animals outside of the lab. Very strict rules in New Zealand. And why I've picked this topic is, well, there's two things. One, the legislation that the National Party has introduced to liberalise New Zealand's pretty strict genetic modification rules seems to have gone into that twilight zone, you'd know it, Guyon, where it's come out of select committee, but New Zealand First is not quite as happy as it wants to be about the rules. And to be fair, they've always been a little bit more nervous about this. And it seems to have stalled. So I'm not even sure that National, which wanted to pass this legislation, which reforms and modernises New Zealand's GE laws, is going to make it before Parliament because it seems to have been stalled in second reading. And the other reason is Mike Munro. You'll remember him, former chief press secretary to Helen Clark. He's just put out a book and he's talked a little bit about this episode of Corngate, as it was known. And that also sparked my interest as well, because I think there's still a bit of residual anger and fury, really, about that whole episode from all sides. So that's what we'll have a go at today. It's an interesting topic. Let's go back, though, and just get ourselves familiar with the fact that National, when they came into power, said it wanted to change our GE laws. Now, for people who are not familiar, we have had an effective ban on genetic modification in this country for about 20-odd years. It can be done in the lab, but it can't be done outside the lab without, technically maybe, but the rules and the regulations are extremely tight, if not the tightest in the world, some of the tightest in the world. So we had the National Party coming in with the agreement of ACT and New Zealand First and their coalition agreement that they would reform this and liberalise it and bring it up to date with some other countries. But as I say, the legislation hasn't made it out of second reading yet. Let's have a listen to the justification for one of the science ministers, because there's been three who have tried to shepherd this through.
Because I think everyone understands that if we want modern health technology, we are going to need to step into this space. I think everyone understands that overseas farmers who have the ability to do what we can't, they are producing faster, better and with less herbicides. They will eat our lunch. So I think people understand this. It's just how we safely do that, how we convey the safety guards and the safety rails that people need. That's the step we're at now.
As I say, that there was Shane Reti, the minister at the time. He's no longer a minister. I think Judith Collins was also in charge of this for a period, and it might be Penny Simmons who is in charge of it now. But cast your mind back, Guyon, 25 years ago, and you think about GE. What comes to mind for you? I mean, there was a lot of concern.
There was a lot of concern in those days, in the late 1990s and in the early 2000s. There was a lot of concern. I think some of it too was wrapped up in the big agribusiness push on some of these tools. And I remember, companies like Monsanto were seen as the sort of evil perpetrators of these by some sectors of society. And I remember particularly the Terminator gene that they, that this seed wouldn't replicate or whatever, and so you had to keep coming back to the multinational who was spruiking it or whatever it was. There was a lot of concern about this, as there is with new technology generally, and I'm watching the AI evolution of that story in a similar kind of way. This was a big story when I was in the press gallery at Parliament in the early 2000s, and which is why Helen Clark called for royal Royal Commission into this to try to get to the bottom of what the risks were. And yeah, as you said in the intro there, this was a massive issue in the, I think it was the 2005 election, wasn't it, with the so-called...
Well, 2002.
Oh,
and
was it
so,
02?
And you're absolutely right about that sense of public concern. So let's just give people a bit of context about the public concern level. So late 90s, you started, a lot of concern in New Zealand was rising about the potential risks of this new technology, which was emerging globally. There was a 92,000 strong petition which actually helped in the end push the 2002 Labour government to set up a Royal Commission of inquiry into genetic modification. And I don't want people to get too wound up with this, but have a listen to this clip of, I guess, some thoughts of people at the time, which, may not have dated so well, but let's have a listen.
It basically is making people sterile.
It's the same thing as going into a restaurant and having your waiter pouring arsenic on your steak.
And not to mention you get some nice big attractive tumors.
Used to be you only got lung cancer. Now you can get cancer of the cancer.
A lot of the information's being suppressed and people need to do their homework.
Yeah, so look, some of those, let's just be clear, and I'll get to this later on, a lot of the science has shifted. So the original GE technology, and I don't want to get into I ain't no scientist, but in terms of the transgenic, this idea that you would take a pig gene and splice it into an apple or something, that's dissipated to some extent because the technology has changed and the new technology or the new wave of GE, and while some people are still concerned about it, doesn't actually involve foreign bodies going into a particular organism. So that's changed a little bit, although there are still groups who clearly worried about it. But that's where people were at. And as you mentioned, that Monsanto and the big company, the corporate element, think of that time too, globalisation.
Well, that's
logo,
right.
This is
the time of Naomi Klein and the pushback against globalisation and trade agreements. And, there's nothing to get people more wound up to than the idea that their food might have been tampered with. And there was a feeling that it was sort of unnatural. There was also, in those days, I remember quite a strong push from some advocates in Te Ao Māori that this went against tikanga and was inappropriate on those grounds too. So yeah, there was quite a chorus of disapproval on this stuff. It was a red hot issue in the early 2000s in New Zealand.
Yes, it was, and that Māori issue is interesting, and that has been addressed by the current Select Committee too. Just as a little sidebar there, they're very big on that. But coming back to this, I want you to think about that Monsanto issue and the corporate affairs as we're talking about, and see if you can guess who this is.
When you take on very powerful biotech companies like Monsanto and large food corporations, who in many ways would prefer that people not know what is in the food that they produce, they're very powerful. You have deregulated the GMO industry from court oversight, which is really not what America is about. You should not be putting riders that people aren't familiar with in a major piece of legislation.
It sounds very much like Bernie Sanders. I didn't realise that he had taken up the cudgel against this.
Yeah, so, it just really...
surprise me, though.
No, and I just want to give people that sense of going back in time a little bit, because it had built up to this push for a moratorium. So it was rumbling away. It wasn't like it came out of nowhere. And so Labour gets elected, the Labour Alliance government gets elected 2000, 99, or the 2000 government comes in, and they, in 2000, they bring in this moratorium on GM while they are having a Royal Commission. So basically they said, okay, look, well the technology's got ahead of our laws. No one will do any planting of GM seeds or whatever out in the field whilst we have this Royal Commission, and we'll figure out what to do. Okay, that's fine. So the Royal Commission gets about its work, does the grunt work. It basically comes up with a recommendation that says, okay, proceed with caution. Don't completely cut off the scientific avenues that genetic modification might provide, but at the same time, you can't take away choice necessarily from consumers and those things, so let's just go cautious. Basically, it ended up with this situation where scientists could keep testing, but it pretty much had to be field trials inside the lab, and anything outside the lab that might potentially spread or whatever, very difficult, if not impossible, to do in New Zealand. Let's have a listen then to Helen Clark talk about what she thought was the benefits of GM.
Well, I think there are times when you have to show leadership, and leadership says that a nation that's going to stop its scientists discovering things is a nation which is heading backwards fast. Now, over my lifetime, I've seen New Zealand's living standards slip and slip and slip. As a government, we're trying to do something about it, and you don't do something about it if you turn your back on science.
And here's Steve Abel, who was at the time an MP now, but it was at GE Free.
I think any government who wants to pursue GE in the way this government seems to be is really forcing people into a response where every reasonable political means has been taken and the government is still pursuing GE in this way. I think it does force lateral approaches to keeping New Zealand GE free.
And what might that include, lateral approaches?
I wouldn't be surprised to see direct action being taken if it comes to that, if there are actual field releases.
Yeah, so some pretty strong stuff, and that is a pretty good reflection of the debate, really, and the division. Of course, listeners will be familiar that whilst this moratorium and whilst this Royal Commission is going on, in the background, turns out there's a seed contamination in 2000. So corn seed arrives and is planted. And then the seed companies basically say, we're worried there might be some genetic modification contaminated with the seeds. And this, of course, causes an absolute panic and palaver in the civil service as they try to deal with this problem. So they do so by coming up with a new threshold for the amount of contamination that's allowed. They said, well, you can't test every single seed that comes into the country, otherwise you'd have to destroy them all. So we'll have a minimum threshold by which we need to know that this particular shipment of seed is GE free. 0.5%, I think, was the number. Now, what's interesting about this, and you may remember, Guyon, is that I think, so they're dealing with this particular problem behind the scenes, the officials. The government comes up with the threshold and released it in a press release just before Christmas, which they issued. And it was, if you look at the press release, I've had a look at it. It's in Nicky Hager's book, Seeds of Distrust. I'll get to that in a second. And it kind of talks about that the need for a new regime and the new, safety and all this sort of thing. And it does mention that there'd been some worries about seed contamination, and it's all good. The government's come up with this new threshold. All well and good. Christmas rolls around. The Royal Commission comes back with its findings. The moratorium that eventually is about to be lifted, and then on the 9th of July 2002, this book arrives. Tell me what you remember about this book. Were you in the gallery at the time when this book, The Seeds of Distrust, arrived?
Yeah, I was, and that was an early election, wasn't it? It must have been a sort of a mid-year election in 2002, because Helen Clark had gone to the country early on the back of the alliance falling apart. Yeah, look, I mean, Nicky Hager, wow, you've got to give the credit to the guy. I mean, there were election campaign after election campaign where he completely dominated. He'd drop some book and the rest of the gallery would go,
Well, I was going to ask you that.
themselves.
Can you name them? Can you name the books?
Yeah, well, certainly he had, so he had Secret Power, which was about the Five Eyes or echelon system. He had a book on timberlands. I'm trying to remember the name of that. I can't quite remember. Obviously, Dirty Politics was one of his biggest ones. And he had the book on, which led to Operation Burnham, the inquiry.
Hit and Run, that's right.
Hit and Run over the Afghanistan and the SAS there. So, yeah, there were some serious inroads that he made in journalism with those books.
And look, he tended to get the emails, get the documents.
He did, absolutely.
He wasn't just making the stuff, he was getting it, basing his arguments
people
on
argued
the
over the interpretation of what he had, but I tell you what, there'd be few people better in New Zealand history about getting information, getting documentation than Nicky Hager. I mean, it was extraordinary how he convinced sources to hand over that kind of information. And, as a journalist,
and I can tell you what, too, I don't know, you might have encountered this too, but I was political editor a couple of times when his books dropped. And he was very effective at his media management. A couple of times I ended up down at Unity Bookshop at just before 6 o'clock, about to go live into the news, and we hadn't seen the book. And the book turns up and you're holding hit and run trying to make sense of, am I going to go on the TV and repeat what he's saying here, that we might have been responsible for civilian deaths in Afghanistan. He's just released it in a book, and he's got I think he had his lawyer, Stephen Price, was there or something. And, you know.
Yeah, and I would have to add to that. I mean, as I say, I'm very in awe of his source material and documentation, but he did have an unorthodox approach to the balance side of journalism, in that he wouldn't go to the other side usually beforehand. And look, he would say, if he were here today, he'd say, well, that's because I would have been injuncted, and often this did happen to him, so it wasn't an unreasonable fear. But he wasn't someone who would lay it all out for the opponents of whatever he was saying and say, hey, what's your response? He tended to just gather everything and smash it out. Now, that is one way to do it. It's not the way I would do it when I've pursued investigative journalism, but he certainly, and it made it, as you say, pretty difficult for us to cover, because this stuff was breaking for the first time. And explosive stuff.
Essentially, the book accused the government of a massive cover-up, that it basically didn't tell New Zealand that there was this issue with seeds that could have been contaminated. Ministers covered it up. That was the allegation. Let me just read you a little bit from the book here. He says, this is in a chapter called Misleading the Ministers. And it says, from the first month after discovering the contaminated crops, it had seemed inevitable that the news would leak out. But now the Prime Minister and officials had started to hope that it could be kept quiet permanently. Knowledge of the issue had, up until then, been strictly limited to about 20 or so officials and a handful of key ministers. Now the cover-up began in earnest. So, pretty dramatic stuff. And look, it's all in the back of the book. The email, he published all in the back of the book. That was the other thing. So the difficulty I had, some people had, when this book dropped, I don't know if you remember, but there was in the gallery in Parliament was the little annex out the back of the beehive, and there was cubby holes down the hallway. And I got into work, and Barry Soper was my boss. He was away. I was pretty junior. And I turn up, and this book, Seeds of Distrust, is just sitting in the cubby hole. I was oblivious. I mean, some of the big guns in the journos and, at RNZ and other places, and obviously John Campbell, we'll get to that, they were all over it. They'd been on it for weeks, but I didn't know anything about it. And I turn up, and all hell is breaking loose. This thing, it broke it, I think, at 9 o'clock that morning or something. And I'm just sort of picking through the book, trying to write stories. And then, not long after that, Michael Cullen came down, the Deputy Prime Minister at the time, absolutely irate. Like, came into the office, wanting to have a go at Barry or something. And I'm just sort of sitting there as this junior. He wouldn't have known barely who I even was. They were apoplectic with rage about what had happened with that book.
Yeah, and you really know, don't you, when the number 2 comes down to the press gallery, that that they're taking it seriously. And in fact, it has the opposite impact of what they want it to have, doesn't it? Because wow, this is they're taking this pretty seriously. It's hit pretty close to the bone.
Yeah. So the book comes out. People like me, we start writing stories. Other media organisations, and everyone. Remember, in that environment, everyone's hyper wound up about this, and then. And then there's, I think it's that night, we had an interview between John Campbell and Helen Clark. Let's have a listen.
Why didn't the government tell us? Why didn't your minister tell us? Look, Marion Hobbs, why didn't she tell us?
If you want to sit down...
That's a fair question.
If you want to sit down a set of questions about this for a properly informed interview, I'm happy to do that. But I'm not going to be harangued on a set-up interview that I've had no advice on.
You're not being harangued.
I am being harangued.
You're not being harangued. It's an entirely reasonable question line, given the importance of the issue, given the importance of genetic modification.
You have to understand that the Prime Minister is the chair of a board. There are responsible ministers. The Prime Minister cannot be expected...
So you're blaming your ministers now?
No, I'm not blaming anybody. I'm blaming you for not giving proper advice about a course that you wanted to follow.
I was not in any way party to this thing.
John, if
it's not in any... You feel free to shoot the messenger.
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't know if you remember when it aired and just how talkback sort of went crazy and people fell into two camps on this. You know, you had those who were arguing that the Prime Minister was ambushed and should have been given more opportunity to actually respond to these allegations, and then TV3 and others, you know, vehemently arguing, no, this was public interest. There was evidence of reasonable evidence of a cover-up. They had every right to do this.
I forget the
tricky one.
Yeah, I forget the sequence, Corin. Had the book actually been published by the time Helen Clark was interviewed?
Oh, no, she wouldn't have had the chance to see it. I'm pretty sure she did it. Yeah. It was the day, she pre-recorded the day before, and then on the day it came out.
There
was no opportunity.
Yeah, so Nicky Hager's guys had given some journalists, obviously, an advance copy of the book, and so that was the ambush allegation, wasn't it? That she hadn't had time, that she didn't know it was going to be raised. It's a difficult one in journalism. I mean, we have this conversation a lot.
We do.
I will tend to give people the bullet points of what we want to discuss, but I wouldn't give them everything. Certainly would never give them questions in advance. And I would like to keep things clandestine if I thought that was legitimate and I thought that it was something that they should and would know. I've always found, though, as a journalist, there's no point asking quite a obscure line of questioning that you wouldn't be expecting them to know, because you just won't get anything. So it's difficult. And
I think it was reasonable for John Campbell to think that she would have known, looking at the documents. But she felt clearly that she just didn't have any time to prepare. What would have happened if they'd have said, I think they'd given a brief outline around genetic modification, but nothing more than that, nothing about this book, nothing about these documents, nothing about all the toing and froing and the threshold and all that stuff.
Yeah, and also remember that Helen Clark was a master political strategist, and I think she probably, in her mind, banked on, well, am I going to engage with this, or am I going to do the trick where you just dig in and attack the journalist? And I think famously she called him a little creep or something.
Well, I was going to ask you that question. You're pretty close. I've got it down as a sanctimonious little creep.
Okay, yeah.
Which is a pretty strong thing to be called by the Prime Minister.
It really is. And she would have backed and banked on the fact, and it probably worked for her. And I'm not taking sides in that debate at all. But she would have thought, well, you know, the public...
I'm not going to win in this, and so therefore I'll just barrel into it.
And the public will probably side against the media, and I'll take on the journalist. And they won, didn't they? And it didn't derail them as much as they might have hoped.
I haven't heard her say too much in the subsequent years, although there was a comment in a Matthew Hooton editorial a couple of days ago where he'd said that he'd spoken to her about it, and she said she was still bewildered by it, or the whole episode. It is interesting. It went to the Broadcasting Standards Authority.
Yes, and I remember, I think that Campbell Live won.
Well, no.
No?
Some reading of it would suggest they lost. Some would say it wasn't actually that bad. They were taken on over the issue of that they'd given Hager more time and maybe sort of an easier ride earlier because it was a program. So they were criticised for that.
And it was TV3. I don't know if it was the Campbell Live show.
No, it would have been TV3. Yeah. They were criticised for that. They were found to have breached some elements of balance and accuracy and fairness on some things because Hager had been treated apparently more gently than Helen Clark, and the question harder questions should have been put to him. But it didn't criticise John Campbell for his interview or for how he carried out the interview. Necessarily, and they actually appealed that to the High Court. I mean, I think it was Mark Jennings, and I think TV3 just to this day I suspect will swear that they absolutely was in the public interest. To do that. It's a tricky one, isn't it? What would be your other options with a story like that? You doorstop them, they walk off.
Yeah, I mean. Sometimes you say, well, look, here are the documents. We are going to ask you about this, and then they've got nowhere to go because you've actually given them the material and you've said, look, we are going to ask you about this, and then you have the argument out live. Now, there will have been, each situation's different, and I can't get in the heads of what TV3 were thinking at the time and what the arrangements were, so I'm not going to make a call on that. But it is a nuanced thing. How much information do you give the politician you are going to interview before you interview them? Now, as I say, I'll say, we want to talk about trade, economics, GE and same-sex marriage or whatever it was, and then I feel free to ask whatever I like.
Exactly, within those parameters. And if you get a random question that comes into your mind, you ask it.
And absolutely. And if you find a random piece of research or a hypocritical statement that was made that contradicted them, then, you've not given any of that to them, and they should be agile enough to answer that. So you certainly don't want to give them everything before the interview. It's just a question of how much you give and what notice you do have. So that was a fascinating exercise in journalism ethics.
Well, I'm going on a little bit of a tangent here because we might as well stay on this interview issue. Let's have a listen to another one. Because let's face it, the Campbell-Clark interview is considered one of the most controversial TV/interviews of New Zealand political history. So I thought, well, let's have a look at some others and see how they compare. So let's have a listen to a famous one with Muldoon. See if you can... It's pretty hard to pick the topic and things, but have a listen.
Customary in an interview for the interviewer to ask questions and for them to be answered singly.
I'm not much interested in what's customary. This is a very important matter for New Zealand.
I agree,
I want you to help me to clarify the issue.
Prime Minister, I would like to ask individual questions, and I would be grateful if you would answer them on an individual basis.
Well, of course I will, but you're not going to set the rules, my friend. This is an important matter, and we're going to get to the truth of it.
If I could take a wild guess, was the interviewer's surname Walker?
Yeah, Simon Walker.
Yeah, Simon Walker. And I think the subject matter was some obscure military issue.
I think it was Soviet...
Was it boats or was it ships and
something to do with the risk of Soviet coming down into the Pacific.
Yeah, and some military capacity of whether we had it or not.
Muldoon actually had a go at him, suggesting that he was supposed to stick to an agreed question line.
Right. Yeah, that's right. That's well, that's always an interesting one too, and a little bit of lifting the curtain into journalism and broadcasting for our audience too. You've got to be very careful about what you do and don't agree on before you do an interview like that. I mean, Winston Peters is someone who will say, well, no, your producers said we were only going to talk about this, that, the next thing, and he'll say it on air live. Yep. So you've got to be very careful because the process starts right when you're haggling for the interview. Will he come on and talk about such and such? What arrangements have been made? And ideally, there won't be any. And you don't want to say, we won't talk about such and such. Sometimes you can make a clear delineation between, say, party matters. If you were interviewing Winston Peters, you might say, well, look, we aren't interested in talking about party matters. We're only talking about ministerial issues or whatever. And then if you did go into, say, the New Zealand First List, then it'd be fair to call you out. So you've got to be very careful about what you say you're going to sign up for, because there's an email trail.
Well, I think it's fair to say we've probably both felt the wrath of interviews with Winston Peters when sometimes those lines get a little blurry about the ministerial hat or the party hat.
Yeah.
Hey, have a listen to this one. I picked out this one because it's just one of my favourites of all time, and you'll be able to remember the context of this one. Have a listen.
I think if there was an election in Saudi Arabia tomorrow and Al-Qaeda was running, they'd probably win.
Some predictions are all right, then.
Well, if you want to waste time on facetious...
Well, we have wasted quite a lot of time tonight, largely because you seem as
No,
angry
what we've
with
done
me.
is I've challenged your questions. And your questions you have not prepared for this interview. You haven't prepared for this interview.
Immoderately angry.
And you waste my time because you have not prepared for this interview, as any journalist done, and I've done many interviews, and the one thing is to prepare for them, and this interview, frankly, is a disgrace.
Well, I love that.
That's John Pilger, isn't it?
That's right.
Yeah, that's John Pilger with Kim Hill on what was it called? Face to Face.
Face Off, I think it was.
Face Off. That program was on TVNZ for a while, and wow, I'm sorry, John Pilger, I've got a lot of respect for you, but don't ever accuse Kim Hill of not doing her research.
I was just going to say
we've both worked with her, and she would be one of the top interviewers in the world.
Yeah.
And I worked alongside her on Morning Report when she'd fill in every now and again, and she's just absolutely extraordinary. And I think, frankly, I mean, John Pilger has obviously done some incredible journalism, but he sounded and behaved very arrogantly in that interview.
Not many interviewers would be brave enough to challenge John Pilger.
No.
I mean, because this was right at the height of I think it was the Iraq War, and he was arguing that, that against it. And she went in and, she was just challenging him to over his arguments about sanctions and all sorts of things. I mean...
Yes, and he would be used to a lot of interviewers who are really just giving him prompts that he could extol whatever his view was. And he wasn't going to get that with Kim Hill, and he didn't like it.
He certainly wasn't. Now, my other legendary, famous New Zealand political interview might stir a few memories. Have a listen to this one.
Yeah. I've got a document in my bag downstairs that says what you just said is a lie.
Do you want to go and get it?
I'll ask my colleague to go and get it out of the back of the car right now. It's in the back folder. You know what it is. It's a letter from Helen Clark stating the circumstances.
Okay, so we might be able to come to that before the end.
Thank you for asking me. Now I've got 3 answers for you.
I'm looking forward to seeing
it. You have misled the public on for so long.
I'm looking forward to it.
And destroyed this
Should
country.
we bring in this document that your staff has got from the
car?
Yes, he's brought one in from the boot of the car.
This letter confirms the arrangements we made on Friday following your offer to stand aside from your portfolio responsibilities while the Serious Fraud Office makes its investigations. Investigations, I might add, which were found to be groundless. There it is. The Prime Minister at the time said, please don't go and tell people that I was sacked. I never was.
Which is a nice segue into talking about...
Can I have it back?
You can, actually. Can I have a copy?
No, you can't. Oh. I just showed you the evidence, and so stop lying to the public.
Okay.
It never ceases to be entertaining, that interview, Guyon.
Yeah, that's a lot of fun. That was, I think I'd said to him, you were sacked 3 times as a minister. And because he was sacked by Bolger, wasn't he, in 91 when he was Minister of Māori Affairs. In 1996, actually in August of 98, he was sacked by Jenny Shipley as Deputy Prime Minister over the sale of Wellington Airport and the Cabinet walkout. And then he'd been let go by Helen Clark in the run-up to the 2008 election as a Serious Fraud Office looked into some allegations. And so when I put this to him in a live interview, that's a live interview, just for people's context. He says, well, no, here's a letter to prove me wrong that he carries around in the boot of his car. It's just extraordinary.
Which is brilliant.
And he says this about 10 minutes in, and I'm watching the clock as it ticks up to 8 o'clock. We did these series of leaders interviews, so this is about 25 minutes long, between about 7:30 and 8 o'clock on Morning Report when I was doing that back in the day. And so one of his staff members goes to get this document from the basement of RNZ and brings it up, and they're sort of knocking on the glass through the thing, so I get him to bring this document in. And of course it's just a letter from Helen Clark basically letting him go from his portfolio, but it was a pretty interesting view in the world where you sort of carry this document around in the boot, ready for pulling it out. But yeah, it was pretty entertaining.
No, it goes down in my book as an absolute classic. All right, we've gone off on a tangent here, and we've talked about interviews. We are talking about GE and Corngate, but I knew we were going to go off on this tangent, so that was all planned, to be completely honest, because it's all good fun. I want to come back though because. So you have the 2002 election. Labour wins, but boy, they were not happy because, you had Corngate maybe knocked the shine off them a little bit.
Yeah.
Maybe it raised concerns that they weren't being upfront with the public, because some people would have sided with, the Nicky Hagers and the media saying, hey, there's a cover-up here. And to be clear, there was eventually a select committee inquiry into all this allegations of cover-up, which kind of said it was more confusion and cock-up than cover-up. But I suspect a lot of the journalists at the time will stand by their claims that it was a cover-up. But nevertheless, Labour doesn't do as well. They end up deciding that they won't go with the Greens, and one of the reasons given was that Labour says, no, we're going to let the moratorium lapse, we're going to go ahead with this, proceed with caution, sort of keep it inside the lab but don't completely rule it out. And the Greens were like, well, we can't go into into a government with Labour. But have a listen to Jeanette Fitzsimons, who was the co-leader of the Greens.
If we'd been prepared to drop our position on genetic engineering, we could have gone into government. But would that really have been the right thing for the party to do? Having campaigned so strongly on the risks of genetic engineering, if we'd said, oh, OK, then, never mind. I mean, it's just not what we do.
Jeanette Fitzsimons, the wonderful Jeanette Fitzsimons, who was the co-leader of the Greens along with Rod Donald, who sadly have both passed, pretty tragically, far too young. They were both extraordinary politicians in their own right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Passionate about the issue of GE. But would you agree? I mean, I think that Helen Clark and the Greens, there was a real frostiness there with the Greens for quite some time. They didn't even get in 2005 either. They were sort of left on the outer. So it took a while, I think, to rehabilitate that relationship.
Yeah, it did, and that would have played a factor. Although, again, Helen Clark, as a master political strategist, always liked to tack to the centre for those coalition arrangements, and I think she relied on United Future, didn't she, in 2002, and then it was New Zealand First in 2005, and I think she always felt she had the Greens in the back pocket on the crossbench, if you like, and didn't need to give them ministerial portfolios, and they never did get into government when Helen Clark had her 3 terms.
I mean, Nicky Hager, for his part, he is adamant he never colluded with the Greens. Greens had nothing to do with it. He was, and I believe him on that. He was just off doing his thing. He was just being an very good investigative journalist.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It culminated, I think, the GE issue probably in 2003 when there was a lot of actors and celebrities very concerned about this issue. There was a group called Mothers Against GE, and they were putting up provocative billboards. And then there was a pretty big protest. You had 35,000, they reckon, walking down the street in Queen Street on, it was 11th of October 2003. So have a listen.
Genetic modification's unsafe. They say, it's unproven.
If in 20 years' time my kids turn around to me and their children are deformed, at least I can say we tried,
For my kids, for the future of them.
We have no idea what will happen when this stuff is released, so take it slowly, take it slowly.
That's a really interesting point there, take it slowly, because we have, and it has allowed the technology to evolve. The new technology is seen by some countries as not even really fitting the same criteria as GE. Some countries look at the new CRISPR version of it and they say, well, it's advanced so much, and so they're more relaxed about it. A lot of countries allow GM and crops and those things, but with regulations and differing thresholds and differing sort of requirements. We are behind in terms of, well, some might argue we do have tighter rules than others. But it's interesting, that time factor. So I interviewed Sir Peter Gluckman when he was the Chief Science Advisor on Q&A. I think it was 2018. Have a listen to what he had to say then.
Well, science, as settled as it will be, that is, it's safe, that there are no significant ecological or health concerns associated with the use of advanced genetic technologies. My judgment is over the next 20 years, genetic technologies will be increasingly used around the world. They are being now. If we are to remain a biological economy, we will have to have another conversation about it.
Yeah, so that was Sir Peter Gluckman then, and so that was probably when you started to see a little bit of a sea change. And what's interesting now is that I think a lot of the opposition is actually possible. There will be some groups who still adamantly argue that even the new versions of genetic modification come with risks and will need regulations, and I'm sure they would, even under Nationals or this government's proposed new framework, they would be regulated. But it seemed that a lot of the opposition, for example, in the Select Committee, was around the economic factors. So,
I mean, this
do we want to give that tag up of being GMO free?
Well, exactly. I was going to mention that there are these two strands, aren't there? There's one.
Correct.
There's the science and what is the health risk, and then there's it doesn't matter so much what that is. What's the perception, and what is reputation, and what is the value in being able to say, hey, we're GE free? So they're kind of a little bit separate. I mean, I'd say on the first one, well, I mean, I don't know that there are any cases. I haven't researched this, obviously, because I walked into the studio not knowing what we were going to talk about, but of anyone actually having their health harmed by eating
No, and the
GMO.
WHO has talked about that.
I mean,
plenty of scientific organisations around the world have.
Happened. No one gets admitted to ED for eating GMO corn chips. I just don't think that it's happened. So I think the argument is fairly weak from what I've read on that basis. The other one is a stronger contention, isn't it? Do we want to have a reputation for being GE-free? Now, personally, I couldn't care less whether food was GE-free or not. It doesn't worry me from the science I've read. And I suppose that's been the argument around even organic food. I mean, can you claim that it's organic, and what are the metrics we're going to use to be able to do that? So, yeah, I get that for choice.
But you're right, that the overwhelming scientific bodies and WHO and Sir Peter Gluckman and others have all, they said, look, the science is settled, it's safe,
Yeah.
So that's where we've sort of landed. And coming right back, and we better finish, it's really interesting, yeah. It seems to have gone into sort of a grey, dark hole of I don't know what's happening with this legislation.
No, well, I mean, yeah, I haven't looked at that recently either. But New Zealand First would, politically, they would see that there could be gains amongst the sceptics, because if you look at the Venn diagram with Green and New Zealand First supporters and people who possibly are worried about issues like vaccination or genetically modified food, there is a slice of the New Zealand First constituency that would be worried about that. Whereas you could imagine that National and ACT would be more follow the science and worry
Labour
about
doesn't
the
support
economy.
it. Greens don't support it. It got through Select Committee with New Zealand First, but to be fair to them, they did say they still had more concerns about the safeguards and they wanted. I don't think they're comfortable with it really being out of the lab, So, but as I say, they've made some public comments from reports that I've seen that they want to see more safeguards. They want to see more tighter safeguards. They're not happy with where it's at the moment, which suggests to me it's going to struggle, isn't it, to make it ahead of the election, and it'll probably require a stronger National Act grouping before there is any actual liberalisation of New Zealand's genetic engineering or genetic modification laws.
Yeah, exactly. And, it'll be interesting to see how we grapple with AI in this context and how we regulate a fast-moving technology, because I can sense that this might be AI, say, in the next term, kind of a similar sort of, issue that GE was in the early 2000s. Where there's a lot of international concern about just where this technology is going.
Data centres, all that it's building. You can see it in the US. There's a lot of states are not wanting to have a bar of data centres.
And Anthony Albanese has just created an AI office in the Prime Minister's office where they're going to look at all these things and the impact on copyright and on the environment and on racial profiling, all those sorts of things. So, I don't want to divert you and go down that track necessarily, but
it's a good way to finish.
It's a modern echo, I think. People should realise that that's how big, that fear that we're getting about AI now, that's kind of where we were at with GE in the early 2000s.
And unfortunately, it comes back to often, there's a big responsibility for the media in understanding the science and understanding the technology so that it can communicate it. And this isn't a criticism of any particular media, by the way, but I can see that how important it is that we try our hardest to understand the science and see it from scientific perspectives as well as human and consumer perspectives as well, because they're not easy issues, are they?
No, they're not, and that Royal Commission was a bit of a hard read. I liked your summation, proceed with caution, because of how many volumes, 3 or 4 or whatever, it was pretty complex stuff.
It was. All right, Guyon, it's good to be back for another series, isn't it, of Context. That's us for this week. I look forward to whatever you've got in store for me next week.
Yeah, I'll hit you back.